What's up, fellow internet denizens? One of the most common pieces of writing advice out there is to write what you know, and a lot of people take this to heart, writing themselves into their works with varying degrees of subtlety. Before we start, it's important to note my definitions of cameo versus self-insert. A cameo, in my opinion, is an artist or author appearing ostensibly as themselves without influencing the story at all, maybe speaking to the main character once. Hergé appears in the background of a lot of Tintin episodes, and even appears as a caricature artist in the movie, for example. And Stan Lee, of course, used to cameo in movies based on his comics. However, both of these authors appeared naturally, not really interacting in an interesting way except for a quip or two, and are not shown to be better or idealized versions of themselves. I see these cameos as sort of an artist's signature or Easter egg akin to the Black Cat and Trigun. If an author just does this, I will not be mentioning them further in this video. A self-insert to me is where the author puts themselves in the story as a character who isn't in the background, sometimes with a different name or a slightly different appearance or personality, but they are still recognizably the author. Sometimes this works, while sometimes it fails spectacularly. I think we should rank these examples by comparing them to different types of physical pain. Let's start off easy. I am giving Jane Eyre a pass here, and not just because this is one of my favorite books. I didn't even realize this was Charlotte Bronte during my first read-through because I didn't have the context surrounding her. It took a college English class to even realize that Jane Eyre could be seen as Bronte's avatar. Now, if you don't know, Jane Eyre is the story of an orphan raised by an unloving family who sends her to a finishing school where she witnesses a close friend die of tuberculosis. She becomes a governess who tutors a young rich girl who is the ward of a rich man with a dark secret. Charlotte Bronte was, in fact, a governess for a time, looked similar to the main character, had a sibling who died at finishing school, and went through similar problems to what Jane faced in the novel, particularly the misogyny that Victorian men held towards single and educated women. Bronte differentiates herself from her character by weaving a story that's more about figuring out somebody else's secrets. While her life is important in the first part, it gives her depth and gives us a reason to root for her. I'd say the latter part of the book is more about the mystery of who Rochester is. I would say that this is less of a case of a self-insert and more of the author writing from experience, but you do get a very good glimpse of Bronte herself every so often. I would say that to the average reader, this type of self-insert is about as painful as a butterfly landing on your shoulder. Now for something a little bit more obvious, Louis Sacker began his writing journey when he was a teacher's aide at an elementary school in the Bay Area. The character Louis in Wayside School is based on his time there. Now for those who never had teachers cool enough to read these books to them during story time, Wayside School is a book of short stories that are essentially baby's first magical realism, taking place at a school that was built sideways where the 19th floor doesn't exist, happiness is a contagion that oozes from the walls, and the balls won't bounce or go where you kick them. At the end of the first book, Louis tells the kids about a school that he used to work at, where nothing unusual happened, and everything was boring, and none of the kids believe it. As the series goes on, Sacker adds more depth to Louis. One of my favorite moments in the series was when he reveals that imagining the horrific possibility of the kids he works with going to a boring school motivates him to keep doing his job. I think that Sacker did a fairly good job of separating himself from his character and making his self-insert actually interesting to the kids who read his book. He was my favorite character. I'd say that this is about as painful as the carbonation in your average ginger ale. Now, one step down from this would be Stephen Pastis from Pearls Before Swine. He portrays himself as a drunken, disheveled smoker who is hated by his own creations, despite the fact that in real life, he allegedly is nothing like this in everything I could find on him. I think he was trying to distance himself as a character from himself as a person. I like this type of gag, where the author is part of the world and potentially controls some aspect of it, but is hated by their own creation. But I think there are not a lot of people who can pull this off right. I'd say this is about as painful as the first shot of whiskey I ever took right after I turned 21. Sure, it was jarring and made me gag a little at first, but I got used to it, and I kinda like it. Now let's talk about the oldest self-insert that I know of. The Canterbury Tales is a collection of short stories framed by the idea that these are all told by people going on a pilgrimage to a saint's shrine in Canterbury, England. There's a contest between everyone on this pilgrimage to see who could tell the best stories. Some stories are wholesome, some are bawdy, some aged poorly, and one is just Sex the Movie. But all of them are unique and highlight the different types of people that you would see in post-plague England. One of these types of people just so happens to be Geoffrey Chaucer himself. When it's Chaucer's turn to tell a story, he tells the tale of Sir Topaz, a knight who ran away from the one battle he was present for and lived in Flanders, which at the time was home to a bunch of storytellers, capitalizing on the fact that the city used to have knights in it. It's a run-of-the-mill story about chivalry and elves, and it gets interrupted by the host, who says that Chaucer's prose is worth less than turds. I am not making that up. Then Chaucer tells the Tale of Melibea, which is the most boring part of the Canterbury Tales, and the second most boring thing that I read as an English major. Here, Chaucer parodies hopeless romantics and people who daydream of knights, himself included, calling them boring and uninspired. I think this kind of clashes with the idea that Chaucer is the arch-narrator. The story was unfinished, so perhaps we were missing an arc where Chaucer, the character, learns to tell stories better. However, this gets a bit of a pass from me because, again, this is possibly the first English instance of a self-insert, and the art was still rather new. On the pain scale, it's like getting your first tattoo. Minor stinging for an hour, but you have someone witty to talk to for the duration. Hirohiko Araki has given mixed answers when asked whether or not Rohan Kashibbe is a self-insert, but has helpfully stated that he would lick a spider. Yes, that is real. I like Rohan, though. Rohan is kind of in the Stephen Pastis vein of dickish cartoonist caricature who writes part of the universe. He blends in well into the JoJo universe, and I think that alone he wouldn't be that fun, but like as a side character, he's fantastic. I'd say Rohan's like a shot of Fireball. Grates on you if you think about it too long, but you're in for a great time if you mix it into something better. Alright guys, you all know what time it is. It's bad fanfiction time! The only times these self-inserts actually work are when the stories are so outlandishly stupid that you feel out of breath, and the best of these are the ones where you can't tell whether or not it's a parody, like Twilight Forbidden Fruit, or My Immortal, or Legolas by Laura. In these, the self-insert feels more like a character that you learn about, as well as a parody of the typical fanfic author. Otherwise, it just feels weirdly forced, like the author wanted to bone one character or wanted to be super special awesome within their favorite universe. The best self-insert fanfics to me feel like a medium sunburn, and the worst of them feel like when you're pulling weeds in a 90-degree day and you brush against a stinging nettle so your hand is covered in welts and you're sweaty, sunburnt, swollen, and sad. Alright, let's get into some really heinous shit now. The Heck series was weird. I have talked about these books before. It's this story about kids who go to hell but for kids, and they were sent to different circles and they meet different historical figures who teach them life lessons. Partway through, one of these kids comes back to life and tries to find someone who can write about this. And he finds this guy named Dale Basie, who is the actual author's name. The kid dies again and ends up back in Heck, and the author dies before he could publish them, and he becomes a teacher in Heck, and then ceases to have ever existed when he finds a snark, like in the Lewis Carroll poem, rendering his entire arc basically pointless. To me, this felt like the author kind of wanted to be part of this weird world that he made, and then realized how cringe this looked and tried to delete himself without affecting the story at large. This entire series was surreal and disgusting. The only reason I read so much of it was because the books were Christmas gifts and I wanted Mom to stop asking me if I read them yet. This self-insert felt as painful as the surface of an active iron on your forearm. The blisters last for weeks and you're scarred for a long time. Unrelated, but never weigh your work clothes down with your arm when ironing. Just a pro tip that I definitely have no experience with. So what could be worse than an author just putting himself into his narrative for shits and giggles and then killing himself? I have two examples, so buckle up. Undead Unluck had so much potential, but the author is the worst kind of pantser I have ever encountered. So it's about this world where some people have powers that start with un, like undead can't die, unluck causes anyone she touches to have horrible luck. Now, these people work for a society that has to fight and capture concepts like decay and autumn, and if they don't do it by the end of each month, more evil concepts spawn, like space. Yes, really. If enough concepts spawn, the world explodes, the universe rewrites itself, a new Earth appears, and history repeats. This was a fantastic concept. The thing is, a bunch of inconsistencies appear early on and get worse and worse until the mangaka writes themselves into the story as an unperson who has this artifact that predicts the future via the world's most popular manga, and Deus Ex Machina's stuff into existence. This is one of only 3 anime that I have quit. I have some mixed feelings, but overall enjoyed it until the shock of Ano Un's arc killed my enjoyment. It made me pause the episode and rant to my husband for 10 minutes. This felt like I had been repeatedly punched in the diaphragm, and then somebody comes up, asks if I'm okay, and knocks out my teeth when I choke out a pathetic no. Okay, so you already know what this last one is. I have ranted about this before, but The Last Dragon Chronicles started off so well. As a somewhat cozy tale of an author named David Rain living with a family who just so happened to make living clay dragons. Then David went to the North Pole to do science, and he merged with a polar bear god and died to save the world, like you do. This could have been the end, but then David came back to life, and his daughter is also kind of a god now, and dragons are coming back to life, and the apocalypse is nigh. Then the apocalypse happens, and David's daughter rewrites the universe with the word sometimes. This could have also been a great end. Then the series got weirder and weirder from there, culminating in it never having happened, except in some books that our favorite polar bear god author wrote, and every character we met until then somehow existing in a bookstore IRL and praising him for writing so well. Then there's an author interview with Chris DeLacy, the actual author, where he confirms that David Rain, the polar bear god author, was a self-insert. At several points in the last 2 books, I found myself closing the book and looking around and making sure everything was real and that I wasn't hallucinating or dozing off. This interview, however, made me toss the book across the room and punch my wall. You shouldn't have to justify how wonky your story is by having every character praise the author self-insert. When entomologist Justin Schmidt wrote his infamous insect pain scale, he noted that the tarantula hawk wasp was the most painful sting he had ever felt, saying that its venom was blinding, fierce, shockingly electric. A running hairdryer has just been dropped into your bubble bath. That is what the last 2 books of The Last Dragon Chronicles felt like. As you can see, there is a wide array of self-inserts out there, and sometimes you can find a good one. I think the best self-inserts are the ones that don't feel too obvious to the audience and draw from the author's life. Here, the authors do show through if you read between the lines, but their stories are interesting and the authors aren't the main focus. We hear about Jane Eyre's life, but that's mostly for context, as the real meat is in Rochester's story. In Wayside School, Lewis is more of a framing device to tell stories about the kids he works with and the weird school he loves, although he does play somewhat of a role in the kids' lives. The other class I would consider good is the ones that are kind of a parody of the author themselves, like Chaucer, Hirohiko Araki, and Stephen Pastis. A lot of these come with some level of self-deprecation, and a couple seem to have minor reality warping capabilities within their world, but usually it's nothing major aside from rewriting someone's history or causing bad puns. I'm also putting some fanfic OCs that border on parody in this category. However, I will say that it takes a very good author to pull these off, or a very bad author if Twilight Forbidden Fruit and Legolas by Laura were written in earnest. Self-inserts that are just there to be super special awesome or to fall in love with someone tend to be mid to bad for me. They are not doing any harm, but they're still annoying and they don't serve a purpose apart from being the author's fantasy persona. We understand that Waterbender of Death 42069 really wants to fuck current fantasy IP character, but there really isn't much else here. The worst self-inserts, though, are the ones where an author made some kind of mistake early on and decided to write themselves into their narrative or use an established character as an avatar and fix their mistakes using god powers and weird dimensional bullshit. Bonus points if they congratulate themselves afterwards. A more organic way to fix a mistake would be to have some kind of exception to a rule, or perhaps have someone clarify the wording on something later. We don't need a magical mangaka who can write things into existence and who writes a manga that predicts the future and that everyone loves. Despite having read a few good self-inserts, I am still very skeptical of writing that includes them because when a self-insert is bad, it is god-awful. So, what do you guys think? What is the worst or best self-insert character you've encountered? Did you guys also rage quit Undead Unluck? Let me know in the comments below. I've been Alien Daydreamer and I am out. Bye!